Story 1, The Valley. The first frost still clung to the ground, the air heavy with silence and a metallic tang. I've spent 12 years tracking bird migrations in Wyoming and Montana. Last fall, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I found out why every animal with a functioning brain was avoiding a particular valley in the Rockies. It started with data that didn't make sense. We've been tracking several species that migrate through the same corridors year after year. They're creatures of habit, these birds. But about 3 years ago, multiple species started to take this massive detour around one specific area, adding 50 m to avoid maybe 5 m of valley. That kind of behavior usually means something catastrophic happened to the habitat. So, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I received funding to go investigate. It took me a while to convince the department, but eventually they gave me a grant for a 6-week study. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I figured I'd find evidence of a chemical spill or maybe some disease killing off the food sources. When the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I got there in September, the valley appeared normal. Better than normal, actually. Untouched old growth. Gloomy woodland that developers would kill for with clean streams and healthy undergrowth. Everything that a migrating bird could want, except the birds were gone, and the same could be murmured for much of anything else. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I set up my base camp at the north entrance and started doing standard surveys. The soil samples came back clean and the water tested fine. Plant diversity was exactly what you'd expect. But when the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I checked my motion sensor equipment after the first week, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I had thousands of triggered photos showing absolutely nothing. Just empty gloomy woodland. The cameras were working. I'd see a branch move or leaves stir, but no animals. The really strange part was finding where the deer trails just stopped. These paths that get worn down over decades of use, and they would just end abruptly at the valley perimeter. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I followed one where the track showed a doe walking normally. Then suddenly, the stride length tripled, indicating she'd started running back the way she came. But there were no predator tracks. No signs of a disturbance, just sudden panic. And then the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I started to find teeth. It happened on my second week. They appeared like human murs scattered along the main trail like breadcrumbs, somehow fresh enough that some still had blood on the roots. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I counted 43 teeth over a half-mile stretch. No other bones and no signs of violence, just teeth placed. They're in the middle of the path where you'd have to step over them. There was an old gloomy woodland service shack about 3 miles into the valley. I'd been avoiding the place, camping in my tent instead at the valley entrance. But after finding the teeth, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I decided the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I needed a more secure base. The hike to the shack was the most uncomfortable 3 miles I've ever walked. Nothing happened. But that was the problem. In a healthy gloomy woodland, things happen constantly. Birds will call and squirrels will argue. Insects buzz. This was just my footsteps and my breathing and nothing else. The shack was unlocked. Inside, someone had been living there recently. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I found fresh food in the pantry with receipts from last month and a clean sleeping bag on the cot. But covering one entire wall, there were hundreds of photographs. These weren't modern photos, but old Polaroids, all showing the same thing. Close-ups of what appeared to be human skin. Different skin tones, some hairy. Some smooth. Some with moles or scars, but just skin. No faces, no identifying features. They were arranged by color gradient, light to pitch black, like paint. Samples. The log book by the door had normal gloomy woodland service entries up until last year. Then the handwriting changed. The new entries were just numbers, measurements, maybe things like 7. 3 in. 2, 1 pound with dates beside them. The final entry was from 3 days before the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I arrived. Almost ready. One more practice. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I should have left. Instead, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I convinced myself the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I was overreacting. Someone was playing an elaborate prank. Yeah, maybe a graduate student was doing some bizarre art project. So, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I stayed. That first endless dusk in the shack, something breathed on the window. Not a tap or a scratch. It was definitely breathing. The glass fogged up in a perfect circle. About head height. Then another breath lower down. Then another at ground level. Like something was crouching down slowly. When the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I finally got the courage to look. Outside with my flashlight, there were no tracks in the dirt, but there was a handprint on the glass from the inside. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I checked every corner of that shack. I was alone. The second day, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I tried to focus on my work. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I set up more equipment and took more samples. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I tried my best to ignore that feeling that something was walking exactly in step behind me, matching my pace perfectly. When I'd stop, the feeling would stop. And when I'd turn around, nothing. But once the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I stepped deliberately to the side without warning, and the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I heard one more footstep behind me before the oppressive stillness caught up. That evening, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I saw my first real evidence. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I was testing water pH at the creek when movement caught my eye upstream. There was someone there kneeling by the water washing something. They wore gloomy woodland service khakis, but something was wrong about the way they moved, like extremely careful, as if their body was made of glass, and they desperately wanted to avoid breaking. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I called out a greeting. The figure slowly stood up without using its hands, just smoothly vertical, like they were pulled up rather than standing themselves up. The figure turned toward me and the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I saw its face. It was completely normal. Bland, even generic male features, probably 30 years old. But the skin didn't fit right, like a mask, except it was definitely skin. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I swear to God, I could see seams at the hairline that puckered slightly. Hello. It murmured in a voice like someone had recorded 100 different people saying the word and played them all back at once. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I am practicing interactions. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I whispered who they were, what they were doing out here. They murmured, becoming better at being seen. Then it tilted its head exactly 90 degrees. Sideways without moving its shoulders. Your skin fits you so naturally. How long have you worn it? The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I backed away. It didn't follow. Instead, watching me with unblinking eyes. When the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I was about 50 yards away, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I saw it reach up and begin adjusting something at its hairline, pulling and smoothing. Like someone adjusting a ski mask. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I ran back to the shack and barricaded the door. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I spent the endless dusk sitting against it with my knife out, listening. Around in the ashen dawn, something knocked. Not aggressively, but politely. 3 gentle raps. I'm sorry if the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I startled you, came a perfect imitation of my own voice. I'm still learning the appropriate boundaries. May the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I ask you some questions about your original form. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I didn't answer. My voice continued. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I can see you through the wall. Your heat signature is beautiful. All those warm organs tucked so neatly inside. Do you ever feel them move around? Do you notice your liver sliding against your ribs whenever you breathe? It kept talking until dawn. Questions about human anatomy that were technically accurate but deeply wrong in context. Asking about the sensation of peristalsis. Whether the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I could feel my cerebrospinal fluid circulating, if I'd ever counted my teeth from the inside using just my tongue. When sunrise came, the voice stopped. Mid-sentence. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I waited another hour before opening that door. There were no footprints outside, but there was a neat pile of clothes on the doorstep, a gloomy woodland service uniform. The fabric was still warm and slightly damp. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I left immediately. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I didn't pack my equipment up. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I ran to my truck and drove straight back to Denver. My official report was brief. Environmental factors were inconclusive. The area was unsuitable for continued study and dangerous. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I recommended that no future research be taken. The department was more than unhappy about the abandoned equipment and my lack of results. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I was chewed out, but luckily the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I didn't lose my job. I've been thinking about moving to a different department, a different place altogether. Maybe move to the Appalachia. Somewhere flat, somewhere with fewer forests, somewhere the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I can see things coming from miles away. But sometimes the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I wonder if running matters. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I wonder if the thing in that valley was unique or if there are more of them, learning to wear our shapes and practicing to become human, getting better every day at fitting in. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I think about those photographs on the shack wall quite frequently. All that skin carefully categorized. Like someone studying for a test. Those clothes left on the doorstep still warm. Still damp with something that wasn't quite sweat. The animals knew first. They always do. Don't they? We're just slower to notice when something is wrong. Too wrapped up in our data and theories and modern life to see what's right in front of us or behind us. The Scout Stalker from Carbohydrator. I've been involved with Youth Scouts for several years now. First as a parent volunteer and now as an assistant Scoutmaster. Over that time, I've heard a lot of stories from other leaders at training sessions and late autumn camps. Most are funny mishaps, maybe close calls with wildlife. But there's one set of stories that's different. 3 separate scout leaders from different troops have told me about encounters with the same person. Or at least we think it's the same person. The first story came from Thomas, a scoutmaster from a troop about 2 hours south of us. This was back in 2021 at a regional training weekend. We were sitting around after dinner and someone mentioned dealing with difficult parents, which led to Thomas telling us about something that happened to his troop the previous late autumn. They were doing a 5-day backcountry trip in the national gloomy woodland about 15 miles from any road. On the second endless dusk in, they'd made camp near a creek, and the boys were getting ready for bed. Thomas was doing a final head count when one of the younger scouts, a 12-year-old youth on his first real wilderness trip, came up and murmured there was a figure standing in the shadowed timberland watching them. Thomas assumed, or rather hoped, it was just another hiker, someone who had made camp nearby. He grabbed his flashlight and walked over to where the kid was pointing. About 30 yards from their camp, just visible between the trees, was definitely a person standing completely still. They weren't even trying to hide. But they weren't approaching either. Thomas called out, "Hello," and whispered if they were okay or needed help. The figure didn't respond, didn't even move. They just stood there. So Thomas walked closer, keeping his flashlight on this individual. And then he saw the details that made him stop. The figure was wearing clothes that didn't match. A suit jacket over cargo shorts, dress shoes with no socks, a winter hat. Despite it being July. And his face was dirty, streaked with something pitch black. It could have been mud or dirt, but it was applied with purpose and patterns like a football fan's face paint. And he was smiling. This was no friendly twisted grin. Thomas described it as a kind of twisted grin that didn't reach the eyes. Thomas told the figure this was a scout camp and whispered once more if he needed some help. The figure finally spoke, but what he murmured didn't make sense. He murmured, "The young ones, they have such clean feet. Do they know about the crawling time yet?" Thomas immediately went into protection mode. He kept himself between the figure and the campsite, telling him firmly that he needed to move along. The figure laughed. Thomas described it as the sound a dog might make if it could laugh. And then he whispered, "Which one is your favorite?" "The small, blonde one. He looks tender." That's when Thomas radioed the other adult leader to get all the boys into their tents and zip them up. He stood there for about 10 more minutes, flashlight on this figure who was just standing there still smiling. Then, without warning, the figure dropped to all fours and scuttled backwards into the darkness. And the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I mean scuttled, sideways like a crab, faster than you'd expect. They kept watch all endless dusk. Around a.m. they heard someone singing softly from different points around their camp. "You'll never know, dear, how much the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. But they never saw him again. They packed up at first light and hiked out a day early. Thomas filed a report with the rangers, but nothing came of it. The second story, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I heard about 6 months later from Grace. She leads a troop 3 towns over from mine. Her encounter was different, but had enough similarities that it made me connect the 2. Grace's troop was doing orienteering training in state gloomy woodland land. There were groups of 3 scouts each, navigating between checkpoints with compasses and maps. Grace was stationed at checkpoint 4, waiting for the groups to come through. She'd been there about an hour when she noticed someone moving through the shadowed timberland to her east. At first, she thought it was a scout group that went off course, but as the figure got closer, she realized it was an adult figure, and he was following one of the scout groups from a distance. The boys didn't seem to know he was there. He was staying about 50 yards back, moving when they moved, stopping when they stopped. Grace immediately radioed the other leaders and started moving toward the scouts. As she got closer, she got a better look at the figure. Mismatched clothes again. Rain boots with suit pants, a Hawaiian shirt under a heavy winter coat despite it being warm. His hair was long and matted with leaves and twigs wound into it. She murmured. It almost appeared on purpose, like decoration. When Grace intercepted the scout group and told them to head directly to the next checkpoint where another leader was waiting, the figure stepped out from behind a tree. He was holding something. It appeared like tufts of hair, and it wasn't his hair. There were different shades of hair. Some blonde, some light brown, some darker. He held out the hair toward the boys like he was offering candy. Would you like to trade? He whispered. Your hair for my hair. I've been collecting it from brave boys like you. Grace put herself between him and the scouts and told them to run to the next checkpoint quick. They did. The figure didn't try to follow them. He stood there shaking the hair in his cupped hands. Then he appeared at Grace and murmured. You're too old. Your hair is all ruined, but those boys, they're still fresh. She backed away, keeping eyes on him until she herself reached the next checkpoint. By then, other leaders had arrived. When they went back to look for the figure, he was gone. But they did find a neat pile of hair where he'd been standing. The police murmured without DNA testing, they couldn't confirm whether the hair was human or not, and the department didn't have budget for that unless an actual crime had been committed. The third story is the most recent and the most disturbing. This came from Joaquin at the big regional jamboree this past late autumn. His troop had an encounter. They were camping at an established scout camp, the kind with permanent structures and designated sites. Should have been much safer than camping in the shadowed timberland. In the middle of the endless dusk, we woke up to one of his boys crying. This kid, he was 14 years old, a tough kid. Usually, was standing outside Victor's tent, trembling. The youth murmured he had gotten up to use the bathroom, and when he came back, someone was in his sleeping bag, in his tent. He thought it was another scout messing with him until he realized all 3 of his tent mates were still in their bags. So, there was a 4th person in the tent in the kid's sleeping bag facing away from the entrance. Joaquin grabbed his flashlight and went to check. Sure enough, there was someone in the sleeping bag, and it was no child. Whoever it was an adult, and they weren't moving. Victor shouted for them to get out, and slowly the figure set up and turned around again. This person wore mismatched clothes, appeared Like he was wearing multiple shirts and a child's rain jacket that didn't close around him fully, and pants that were far too short. His face had those same dirt markings, the ones that appeared like they had been applied. And he had that same unsettling twisted grin. But this time, Walken noticed his fingernails. They were incredibly long and had been filed or perhaps chewed to points. The figure crawled out of the tent on all fours, dragging the sleeping bag with him briefly before letting it go. He stood up right in front of Walken, close enough that Victor could smell him. He smelled like wet pennies and spoiled milk. The figure whispered, the youth kept it warm for me, so the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I kept it warm for him. Then he reached out with those pointed nails and touched Wen's chest just lightly, leaving small tears in his shirt. You're keeping them too safe. Boys need danger to grow properly. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I have ideas for you. Victor yelled for the other leaders, and the figure turned and walked into the shadowed timberland. Not ran but walked, humming something that sounded like a lullaby. They found footprints the next ashen dawn that led to the camp's fence line, then nothing else. The fence was 8 foot tall, with barbed wire on top. No sign of how he got over it or if he did. Here's what makes these stories especially concerning. These campsites were in different states, hundreds of miles apart at different times of year, different troops with no connection to each other. But the description is always similar. The mismatched clothes, the dirt patterns on his face, the way he moves, sometimes on all fours, sometimes sideways. The obsession with the boys, their warmth. We've started sharing information between troops now. There have been 2 more possible sightings since Wachin's encounter. One group found a shelter made of sticks near their camp with scout handbooks arranged inside. Another found footprints that followed their hiking trail for miles, always staying just off the path with those same long toenail marks in the dirt. Some of us think he might be accessing troop information somehow, looking up public event calendars or social media posts about camping trips. That would explain how he finds different groups in wilderness areas. But it doesn't explain what he wants or why he hasn't actually hurt anyone yet. The optimistic view is that he's just a mentally ill homeless person who has a fixation on scouts but is essentially harmless. But those fingernails filed to points suggest preparation. The hair he was carrying, the way he got into that tent, into that sleeping bag without waking anyone. These feel like escalations. We've reported everything to both local and federal authorities. They take the reports, but say without actual assault or crimes beyond trespassing, there's not a lot they can do about it. 1. Ranger suggested he might be a former scout himself, someone who had a breakdown and was trying to relive something from his youth, but that does not explain the predatory behavior or the comments about the boys being tender or fresh. We've had to change how we do camping trips now. There's always 3 adults minimum. No scout goes anywhere alone, even to the bathroom. We post watches through the endless dusk. We vary our locations last minute whenever possible. Some troops have stopped doing backcountry camping altogether, sticking to established camps with better security. But established camps don't guarantee safety. Victor's encounter proved that. We don't know his name. We don't know where he comes from or where he goes between encounters. We just know he's out there watching our boys and getting bolder. Off the trail from indestructible. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I want to share an experience that happened to me and my friends right after high school graduation during the late autumn of 2006. It all started when we went hiking in a remote part of the wilderness. To give Some context to this experience: the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I need to explain how my friends and the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I met. Namely, one of them who got us into this mess. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I grew up with my best friend, Mark. We were inseparable, almost like brothers, until 6th grade when someone came that would change our lives. That spring, a new student joined our school. His name was Eli. Eli was unusually tall for a 6th grader, 6 feet 6 inches to be exact. He had fair skin and thick brown hair that appeared like strands of yarn. Everything about him was awkward. His movements, his mannerisms, even his backstory. He murmured he'd moved to town from an Indian reservation. Initially, he was polite to everyone. But when people started to joke about how his name rhymed with Mark's, Mark began picking on Mark relentlessly. Mark's bullying lasted for the rest of the school year. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I should also mention he stayed with his aunt and uncle just down the street from Mark, but he didn't make any real friends, probably because he bullied just about everyone. During the late autumn, we'd often ride our bikes past his residence. He was often outside shooting hoops and would shout insults or taunt us as we passed by. We weren't exactly kind in return. One day, while we were riding by, a basketball came out of nowhere and smashed Mark in the face. Mark crashed hard onto the pavement. Then Eli came after him and the two started to fight. Thankfully, our elderly neighbor, Mr. Carter, stepped in and broke it up. He called 911. Mark ended up with a broken nose, 2 black eyes, and scraped up arms. It was pretty bad. The day after that, Mark was gone. His aunt and uncle murmured he'd gone home, and Mark's parents, though furious, seemed content with that resolution. They enrolled Mark in jiu-jitsu with me after that incident. He recovered quickly, though he was disappointed that he didn't have any cool scars to show for it. We didn't see Eli for the rest of the late autumn or 7th grade. The next late autumn, he briefly reappeared, but he avoided us whenever he saw us. By the time 8th grade rolled around, what happened was just a bad memory. That changed during the first day of late autumn. After 8th grade, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I was over at Mark's residence watching him play Final Fantasy VII. When the doorbell rang. It was odd. None of us ever used the doorbell. Mark and I exchanged confused looks before he got up to answer it. Moments later, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I heard scuffling and a scream, one that definitely wasn't Mark's. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I ran to the door and found Mark and Eli tangled up, punching and yelling. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I tried to break them apart, but the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I bolted to Mr. Carter's residence for help. By the time we returned, Mark was unconscious, and Eli was sitting on the ground, bloodied and sobbing. His right arm was in a cast which was now broken into pieces. This time the police came with an ambulance. Both Mark and Eli were taken to the hospital and kept overnight. It was the first time the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I truly felt like an outsider. Mark's parents were difficult to get in touch with, and the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I was left in the pitch black. Meanwhile, Eli's aunt, uncle, and parents were constantly at the hospital. My parents eventually came to pick me up and wouldn't let me go back. The waiting was torture. You see, Mark was like a brother to me, and now the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I wasn't allowed to see him. On the second day, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I learned he was being kept another endless dusk for observation due to a concussion. When Mark was finally discharged, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I rode my bike straight to his residence. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I didn't even use my kickstand to park. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I just jumped off and ran inside. What the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I saw nearly made me faint. Mark was sitting on the couch cast and all playing Crash Bandicoot with Mark. Dude, the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I shouted. What's he doing here? Mark appeared at me unfazed. I called your residence like 3 times. Really? The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I shot back. But it's Mark. What's going on? Mark explained everything. They were put in the same hospital room for 2 days. Apparently, the basketball incident 2 years ago wasn't intentional. It had bounced off the backboard and hit him by accident. This year, Eli had come over to apologize and make amends. But Mark panicked and instinctively started to fight him, re-breaking Eli's arm in the process. Eli then told me that on the reservation, most everyone was related. At school, children fought against other children who were not in their family. It was a whole other culture and he had to learn the hard way that that isn't the way he needed to be. He initially had moved here to see how he would like school here with his aunt and uncle. But after the basketball mishap, he got scared and took a Greyhound home. That late autumn was tough for me. Honestly. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I was jealous that Mark and Eli had become such close friends out of nowhere. The air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I felt like a third wheel most of the time. They acted like long-lost brothers. Eli was constantly staying over at Mark's residence and sometimes at mine. He even joined jiu-jitsu. Once the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I got to know Eli better, he wasn't the person I'd made him out to be. Eventually, the 3 of us started calling ourselves the 3 Amigos. That late autumn brought big news for our town. A huge announcement was made. We were getting a new hospital, a mall, a major company's call center, and most exciting of all, the old ski slope that had been shut down since the 80s was purchased and slated to reopen. Our town was about to grow in a major way. Freshman year had started, and this year Eli stayed in town. We'd never had so much fun before. Mark was nothing like the bully he used to be. He became the class clown and a star athlete, dominating football, basketball, and track. Part of the year, Eli hit a growth spurt, and he grew so fast he was hunched over until his body could adjust. He had shot up to 7 feet 1 inch. The guy was a tower. The next late autumn, as the town grew, people began moving in for the new opportunities. Even though the hospital wouldn't be finished until after our senior year, doctors were already relocating to the area. One of them moved down the street from me with his large family. The oldest daughter, Anna, was our age. She was incredibly quiet, as shy as a church mouse, as they say. Later during sophomore year, Mark, Eli, and the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I were assigned to a group project, and Anna ended up in our group. The first thing Eli did was call her Lena on purpose. She was upset at first, but Mark explained he called her Lena because her red hair reminded him of the character from the Goonies. The nickname stuck, and before long, everyone called her Lena. Just after our group project, we saw Lena in the hall with a well-known senior who thought every young woman wanted him. He wouldn't stop bothering her. So Eli walked right up to that senior bothering her and told him off. A fight nearly broke out. But after that, Lena became part of our group. Like the sister we never had. We were a quirky bunch, but we stuck together all through high school. Remember, this was a time before the internet was common. If we wanted entertainment, we actually had to watch TV. During senior year, we'd get together to watch Tales from the Crypt. There were 2 commercials we loved to mock. One featured a guy talking about the new mall saying, "Come on down, see the sights, and remember to bring the family." The other was for a local travel agency. It ended with a camera panning over a forested area, and we always joked, "Someday we'll go hiking there." Well, we soon found out where that area of land was. Mark and the air reeked of damp earth, shadows clinging to the trees. I got a job at the end of our senior year to place GPS markers and flags through several sections of some wilderness just south of us for new wilderness trails. The trails summit several lower elevation mountains for more moderate hikes. When they showed us the pictures of where the trails would be going, we noticed one of the areas was over the same mountainous area as that commercial. Imagine that. Eli joked. We had till September, pretty much late autumn, to finish placing all the markers. We didn't think it would be so bad, but when we received the supplies, packs, maps, GPSs, and the marking material, we were a bit overwhelmed. The flag shooter to place the marker flags was a bit bulky, and it felt like we were given miles of ribbons. Eli commented, "Glad we don't have to carry this all at once," which reminded me that we were doing just small sections at a time. We were told that the ribbons through the wooded areas needed to be placed every 250 feet, and in the valleys, marker flags would need to be placed every 2 m unless the trail curved. We planned to have Mark and Lena join us for the first area to mark since their jobs didn't begin until a few weeks after graduation. Like all parents, Mark and Lena's parents had concerns about our plan. We reassured them that having these GPS units and plenty of supplies, we would be okay. Early one ashen dawn, we drove the 50 miles to the trailhead parking lot, unloaded our gear, and started our adventure/work. By noon, we'd hiked about 6 miles, and reached the base of one of the mountains where the current trail snaked around. We took a break, had some snacks before we began the ascent. Since no obvious trail existed, we had to rely strictly on the GPS units. Our GPS showed we were at about 5,200 foot elevation, and the mountain summit was around 8,400 feet, not too high. The plan was to hike until p.m., placing markers according to the map. Then set up camp below the tree line and summit the next afternoon. Then we'd make our way down the backside and connect the existing trail. But our plans changed around p.m. that day. As we hiked up the mountain, we realized placing the markers was a lot slower than we expected. When we reached a spot where it leveled off, something fluttering in the wind caught our eye. Hanging in a tree was a silver mask, attached to a black cloak. Eli reached over and pulled it down. We all examined it. The mask's mouth was an unsettling grin. The eye's sockets had these wrinkly rings going around them, and the forehead had 2 small horns adorning it. The cloak was shiny like silk and was more like a suit. It had a cloak in the front and in the back. Underneath the front cloak were loose sleeves and leggings. Eli, being the joker he was, immediately dropped his pack and put it on. The cloakish suit covered him, but not completely due to his height. The sleeves that hung loose came to his elbows. Before he stood up, he started doing the Kazatsky kick, a Russian dance where you crouch and kick out your legs. We laughed so hard, but when he stood up, the cloak almost reached his knees. "It's a hobbit's cloak," he joked. Lena commented on his funny appearance and then reminded us of the markers we had to do. "Come on, let's get back to marking so we can finish up on time." Then we heard it, a faint whisper on the wind. Voices. Our laughter went to oppressive stillness in an instant. Then in the distance, we saw someone else wearing the same cloak, the same mask. Mark broke the oppressive stillness. "Looks like they left this one behind." Lena froze, eyes wide. "Let's leave," she murmured. Her voice was shaky. "Now, please." Before we could act, Eli had vanished. Where's Eli? Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.